In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at strain theory. We'll be focusing initially on its origins, looking at the ideas of Emile Durkheim and Robert Merton, but then we will turn to look at how strain theory in some way, shape, or form is being applied in a variety of environments in criminological theory and criminological analysis in our modern world. When we are discussing or considering classical enemy or strain theory, we have to begin our study by looking at the ideas of Emile Durkheim, again, an individual considered to be the father of modern sociology. Born in 1858, Emile Durkheim provides us with the concept of collective consciousness. His study of crime is one that can be considered functional in nature, not as much looking at social structure, but looking at how social institutions, social practices, and of course, different scales of social groupings function in terms of criminological activity, either in this case as a deterrent or something that is reinforcing a deviant act. The term enemy, which again is really expressed earlier than the idea of stress or strain as it relates to this theoretical school, it's actually derived from a Greek work, or Greek word rather, which means without norms or lacking norms. Merton, who will use this later, but then initially Durkheim, who's using this, is seeing this expression as being integral to how and why people act in a way that is considered to be deviant, that they are in some way, shape, or form without norms, or they are not considering normative behavior when they are perpetrating an act. Durkheim believed that the society was ultimately responsible for not only the actions of its members, but also for maintaining a sense of cohesion or cohesiveness between individuals within that society. And this is where the concept of social disorganization and this enemy theory or strain theory really begin to overlap. You really can't separate out the two. The idea that social cohesion is maintained by particular cues within an individual's environment and within an individual's social relationships. Now, Durkheim used the expression social solidarity to, in a sense, describe that very important core function of a society, which was maintaining a sense of social cohesion, not only for individuals, but for everybody within its borders. He recognized that social solidarity, this sense of cohesion, was maintained within the mind of individuals in the society itself, kind of a collective conscience or a collective consciousness that all individuals were partaking in through their actions and through their relationships within that society. Now, he recognized two kinds of solidarity which were a product of this partaking within a collective conscience, or two expressions of social cohesion. The first he recognized to be a kind of mechanical solidarity. This was most common and it was the easiest to observe. This ultimately was law and law enforcement. The second kind of solidarity that Durkheim recognizes is a little harder to pinpoint. It's something that is much more psychological and sociological in nature. This is ultimately the framework of the society itself. An organic solidarity, an example of this would be a class structure. The idea that your understanding of your behaviors are being framed by your position, your structural position within a society. This is again something that is a little bit harder to observe directly because, again, it's how an individual is interpreting their position within a society and the social and cultural circumstances which surround that particular position. Another good example would be division of labor. Right? The idea that your socioeconomic status within a society and the jobs that you are partaking in are all part of your position within that larger social structure. And so, in a sense, Durkheim is seeing an interplay between these two kinds of expressions of social solidarity. You have this kind of almost Weberian constant thread of force that always exists out there, the laws of the society, and then you have the position that individuals and groups have within that society. And they again interplay with one another, and people will ultimately violate the rules or the norms that are associated with their position or things that are codified in a law, and then the society reacts to that in a sense. And it's this constant strain, this constant give and take in negotiating normative behavior and one's participation in larger patterns of normative relationships and the behaviors associated with those that ultimately maintains the cohesion or the cohesiveness of a society. And Durkheim, in a sense, is recognizing any and all violation of that cohesion through an infraction in solidarity, a violation of this conscience that we all carry collectively, that is the root of criminal acts or ultimately a deviant behavior. So the rule of law, in a sense, is a product of solidarity. It's a product of negotiating solidarity. We have the mechanical solidarity, which ultimately is designed to deter criminal action or any sort of deviant behavior, maybe even prevent it by its mere nature. And then you have the organic solidarity, this larger framework that everyone lives within and partakes in and has a vested location within or an interest in. And this kind of, again, maintains the society. And how these solidarities are negotiated over time ultimately leads to cultural and social change. And that's how Durkheim was able to then also connect his ideas regarding strain and, in this case, normative behavior or the existence of an individual or a group that lacks norms as it relates to larger society, how he's able to understand how a society is changing over time. It's this negotiation, this constant negotiation. So in Durkheim's ideas, we see the seeds of later understandings of strain, social strain, and social stress in a theoretical way. We see the seeds of this being laid. And so that's a really important point that Durkheim is setting the framework, albeit a functional framework, for what eventually becomes strain theory in criminology. The ideas of Robert Merton, born in 1910, represent kind of the next logical historical step in our movement toward modern expressions of strain theory. In fact, Merton's contributions really represent the first true codification of strain theory as it relates to deviant behavior. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with regard to Merton, kind of juxtaposing his ideas with earlier concepts of Durkheim, is that Durkheim was very much looking at function, whereas Robert Merton is addressing social structure. It's not that the two are diametrically opposed to one another. They will overlap. You can't ignore how a structure functions theoretically. But the idea here is that the initial premise in terms of how to answer criminal activity or to be able to curb criminal action or prevent a deviant act. This is theoretically different between Durkheim's perspective of social solidarity and Robert Merton's codification of the strain and social stress construct. The other thing that is inherently, I guess, different when you're comparing Durkheim's vision to that of Robert Merton is that Merton is looking at the structure of a society, its social institutions, and how they house social relationships and role players, acting on those relationships, or even vice versa, how the social structure exerts pressure on people within the society. Sometimes that pressure is positive, right? It's leading them toward culturally recognized norms, um, or in a sense, it can have a negative effect where maybe the circumstances under which an individual lives is leading him or her to act out in a way that does not follow kind of a due process toward accomplishing a goal or having success as it relates to how success is being framed by the larger society. The additional piece of Merton's ideas that, again, varies from the ideas of Durkheim is that he was also looking for solutions. He was actively looking for how the social structure can, in a sense, reinforce positive kinds of behaviors. Um, Both Durkheim and Merton do connect to the idea of social and cultural change, but ultimately they vary in this in a sense that Merton is looking for how we as a society, as we continue to change and develop with regard to our norms, how we can be a part of that dialogue, how we can, in a sense, find solutions to patterns of deviance or patterns of deviant behaviors, not only in individuals but in larger groups of individuals. Ultimately, what becomes our understanding of subcultures. So let's take a closer look now at Merton's ideas. One of the first things that you have to focus on when you're looking at strain theory through the eyes of Robert Merton is that we have an initial strain that exists between structures in a society that are inherently social and those that are inherently cultural in nature. Now, he recognizes a social structure to be, in a sense, the behaviors, the patterns of behavior that are ultimately normative in achieving some sort of task. They are the best means by which the society recognizes a task to be accomplished. This would be smaller in scale. It would be something that you or I would have a direct interaction with. We would have a much more intimate understanding of. And it would be ultimately something that would be much easier to directly observe and study when it comes to applied research. When you think about another structural area, that of cultural structures, this is something a little more philosophical, a little more something that is psychological in nature. And again, it is the approved goals that a society has for outcome. So the idea here is that, or as it relates to outcome, um, the goals that you establish early in life. Strain theory is something that you see applied quite a bit to juvenile delinquency. So the idea here is that you or I, as we grow up, as our personalities are developing, as we have a sense of identity, as we move out of an irrational kind of early childhood to a more rational subadult and then early adult mind, we realize that or we have an understanding of what success is. Generally, that idea of success is something that is culturally rooted. It's a big picture kind of construct. The idea of having two cars, a dog, two children, a white picket fence, and a home that you're actively paying for, a job, so on and so forth. Right? We could probably list out a lot of these ideas, and really a lot of these ideas are connected to what is referred to as the American dream. Right? Well, that is a cultural kind of structure. Now, the strain comes in when we either don't have the means of achieving that, or if the normative means do not allow us to achieve that goal because of some sort of obstruction, um, or when we feel that we are disenfranchised from being able to achieve that because of some sort of structural discriminatory construct, right? And that creates tension and strain, either strain between the two forms of structure or strain within the individual and their mind as they are realizing that they may not be able to overcome the obstacles that are preventing them from achieving cultural success. And that's kind of the heart of Merton's idea. And again, these are structures for the most part that are interacting with one another. Now, as I said before, Merton then takes this and says, well, what's the solution, right? What's a social and cultural solution for this particular kind of strain? And that's where Merton's model becomes even more dynamic than what we saw with Durkheim. The other thing that is unique to Merton's contributions to what is developing to be strain theory is that sometimes persons may be pressured to behave in a way that is not conforming to a social norm. So the idea here is that the cultural structure, which is giving us a sense of success, right? Let's say um, having a lot of money, right, or financial security. Uh, but the social structure, intimate to, let's say, the relationships that an individual has, or their subcultural membership in terms of a smaller grouping within a society, or how they were socialized, how they were raised, and the particular kinds of ideas that were part of that socialization. Those social structures might say, well, you can achieve that level of success through some sort of criminal act. So rob banks, and that's how you get to be rich, or um, join the mob and become rich and wealthy that way. Kind of again circumnavigating some of the social structures that most people are adhering to. The idea of waking up in the morning, getting ready, going to work, working hour to hour, doing the best you can at that job, coming home, collecting a paycheck, right? And so that's another aspect of Merton's contributions that we should keep in mind. So when we step back and look at all of this, we realize that again, Merton is giving us generally a theoretical school of thought that is much more structural than functional in nature. It's one that is looking at how structures compete within the mind of the individual and within the society itself and its history, and how change comes of that constant strain and negotiation that occurs between these structures. Then what Merton does is he says, okay, let's focus on um, a way to solve these dilemmas. And so he starts to lay out for us a kind of typology. And this typology recognizes, in this case, particular kinds of models or modes that relate to recognizing a social goal. This would be a cultural structure. And then engaging or how one or a group chooses to achieve that goal, or the means by which one can achieve that goal. And so he recognizes these models, some of which are good or recognized ideally by a society as being positive, and then others that are considered to be more negative. And so he initially recognizes things like conformity. This is, again, an acceptance on the part of the individual and then the group that the means that currently exist for achieving a cultural goal are the best ones because they're the ones that the society is saying we approve of. And so conformity is really recognized to be kind of a positive outcome as it relates to how people are achieving their goals and, again, not turning to more deviant acts. Beyond this, he moves to another mode or model, in this case, innovation. This is where we, again, accept the goals that we have in terms of things like success, but we are interested in coming at them from a different angle. So looking at more than just the common means to achieve that goal, right? Being a little more innovative or inventive. This is where sometimes we're kind of on the fence when it comes to positive or negative kinds of outcomes. The idea that we can find an innovative way that is positive, that helps to push the society forward, let's say being an entrepreneur, and that is helping you, the individual, to achieve your financial goals in a way that is or conforms to um, the interests of the society. Innovation can take a negative or can turn to the kind of negative side of things when, um, let's say, you decide to hack into people's bank accounts, right, as a means of achieving economic success. That is wrong. That's a deviant act, but it is innovative in nature. He recognizes another model for adaptive change, ritualism. This is where we as individuals or as groups reject the goals that we are given on a cultural level, but we are still adhering to the means that were commonly assigned to achieving those goals, right? So we may not, in a sense, deviate from traditional practices, but we may not accept financial success as an important life goal. Moving beyond that, he also has what is referred to as rebellion. Rebellion is a kind of situation where we reject the cultural outcomes and the means by which traditionally those outcomes are achieved. And we do so with the hope of transforming the society. So, this is where we become much more cognizant of the functional mechanisms that are at work within a society, and we're fighting back or rebelling against that. And then another model or mode that he has is the last one here is retreatism. The idea that we reject both the goals and the means, again, similar to what we have for rebellion, but we then retreat into kind of a failed state of affairs. And we ultimately kind of isolate ourselves from anything that is considered to be positive. And we are, um, in a sense, not able to achieve things through illegitimate or legitimate means, and we just kind of drop out of the equation or out of society itself. So these are all, again, ways that Merton is trying to explain the change that he sees in society and how and why people behave in particular ways as that change occurs. He also uses these models or modes to be able to explain, in a sense, how the actions of individuals negotiate social structure. Now we move to the applied area of strain theory, specifically looking at contemporary approaches toward dealing with social strain. And this, in a sense, is where we see Merton's ideas as a bridge across to practical public policy. There are 1,001 different theoretical schools of thought and models that can be assigned to modern approaches toward dealing with social stress or social strain, but I'll be highlighting two of them for you as part of this lecture. The first one relates to the work of Stephen Messner and Richard Rosenfeld. Rosenfeld and Messner are looking at more of the economic side of deviant behavior. So they're looking at criminal acts as they relate to economic success. Again, that cultural structure that Merton would identify. And ultimately, how people are choosing the means by which to achieve that success. In this case, things that are maybe white collar crimes that are associated with personal economic gain. Now, the key to this institutional enemy theory is the idea that, again, we look at structure and we say to ourselves, okay, what in the design of a society, what aspects, structural aspects of a society are preventing people from achieving their goals? And again, identifying those obstacles is very, very important. Then, in this case, public policy, as it relates to criminal justice, is then geared toward removing those obstacles, or in some way, shape, or form, even helping people to restructure their view of personal or economic success. The reason why this particular theoretical framework is labeled as institutional is because they recognize social institutions as being major players, not only in the cultural structures that people take on psychologically, but that they are also major players in interfering with the kind of proper interaction between social structures and cultural structures. The idea that there might be something in an educational system, there might be something in a political system, there might be something in a judicial system that is actively preventing people from succeeding or being treated fairly in those social, economic, political environments. And they also look at things systematically, the idea that there is a certain level of feedback that exists between, let's say, discriminatory practices that are in an institutional level, and in this case, an individual's inability to achieve success and his or her choices regarding their behaviors. So they see a real strong connection between rates of crime and institutional imbalance. And that as we start to see crimes occurring at different rates for different groups within a society, we are also looking not only at obstacles that those groups may be dealing with, but then also you are starting to see the impact that the criminal justice system has on placing individuals in a status that then continues to send them down a road of injustice or the idea of inequality, right? So the idea that if you are convicted of a crime, which then prevents you from um, practicing, or maybe a better way of thinking about it is you have been convicted of a crime and that deters you from certain employment opportunities. That can be a real problem. Or if you feel disenfranchised, literally, because you have been imprisoned for a particular level of crime, and now you can no longer vote in a particular municipality as a result of serving time or your participation in that criminal act. Now you are again at a disadvantage. You are experiencing inequality and an inability to achieve, in this case, some sort of cultural uh, view of success. So, their answer to this then is to take a look at how institutions are changing and then to be an active player in that process of change, either as the individual making life choices, socializing others, working together with others to achieve particular goals, or um, in this case, as politicians or people of higher positions within the society who can actively reform the institutions of that society, making them more equitable for individuals, um, providing opportunities for individuals, allowing individuals to serve time, but not necessarily penalize individuals after they have left the correctional system, so on and so forth. So these are the kinds of approaches to strain and dealing with stress that Messner and Rosenfeld are looking at. They recognize social and cultural reform on a structural or institutional level to be the answer to um, deviance and to reduce deviant acts within the society or to prevent a normalization of deviance within a social historical circumstance. Robert Agnew provides us with probably what is the middle of the road when it comes to a modern or contemporary application of strain theory or enemy. Um, his ideas have generally been summarized in what is known as the general strain theory. So, strain theory, as it relates to Agnew's work, this is again a a theoretical school of thought that incorporates things like social disorganization, addressing that, um, enemy or deviance, and how people are participating in deviant acts, and then also the role that subcultures within a society, especially those associated or built around uh, non normative approaches toward achieving success, how those subcultures, a gang would be a very good example of this, how those subcultures are also incorporated into social strain, social stress as it's experienced by the individual, and then also how that individual is straining or stressing against the institutions that surround and house the individual. Those institutions ultimately, by their scale, that are connected to the society. And here we see that emphasis on an applied view of a theory. The idea that, okay, we recognize that there is such a thing as social strain. We understand what plays into how people experience strain. We understand that there are varying scales of strain, sometimes between institutions within a society. But now the question we have for ourselves, and Agnew challenges us on this, is how are we going to solve or address that particular strain, especially if it is something that is connecting intimately with deviant or deviant behaviors. So when Agnew is taking a look at how a person experiences strain, he creates a typology to be able to address it. He takes a look at how an individual is confronted with maybe a negative stimulus in their society. Maybe a person is struggling at work, or a person feels victimized in some way, shape, or form, or somebody is truly victimized, or somebody is having challenges at school. And again, how does a person react to that particular kind of strain. Or he looks at strain that can occur when an individual begins to lose stability in his or her life. The idea here is that maybe a loved one passes away, or it might be a situation where a romantic relationship ends prematurely, or an individual might be experiencing, in this case, economic loss. That can also create strain for the individual. It can be in its own right an obstacle for achieving an outcome that we establish or the individual establishes very early in life. And then he also creates a category or a type of social strain as it is experienced, because that's again where he starts in terms of applying what he's learning from his research. Um, where we have a disjunct. In this case, we have our own individual expectations, many of which are given to us through cultural structural means, and then there is a gap or there is a disjunct between those expectations and how we are able to achieve that. And again, this is where some of these institutional obstructions start to emerge and where they become very, very recognizable. So this kind of three-tier typology of strain is where Agnew begins his analysis as he's moving toward kind of a solution-based model. So once he has been able to identify a source of strain or a type of strain, then he turns to some answers. And again, a crime or a criminal act may not be the immediate outcome of this kind of social struggle, or it may not be the response to strain, but ultimately how or what the strain is and how an individual reacts to that strain is important to understand it. It is something that can provide solutions not only to crime rates, but also solutions with regard to being able to give people opportunities to achieve their life goals. So, what is the then answer that he gives to this with regard to larger social structures? Well, first he says that we have to eliminate strains that are conducive to crime, things that are maybe by their nature a problem to start with. So if you have sources of childhood trauma, if you have juvenile delinquency that spreads beyond the individual in some way, shape, or form, and this is where these kinds of subcultural affiliations may work their way into the dialogue, or bullying, um, as an example of something that may lead to later deviance, we need to address that and eliminate it. Right? So the idea of eliminating sources of strain or stress, not only for the individual who's being studied at that moment, but individuals that are part of larger communities or collectives. The next thing that he suggests as he starts to develop his theory is that we need to if we can't remove a social stress or strain, we need to be able to alternate or alter it rather in some way, shape, or form, make it less conducive to a criminal act. So being able to, in a sense, provide people with the tools to be able to address stress or strain in a non-criminological manner. And then finally, kind of the last solution that he gives in terms of this theoretical model is that we need to remove individuals themselves. Um, and again, on a large scale. So not just one individual, but people who maybe are fitting a typology for experiencing strain or stress, to be able to remove them from an environment that is um, conducive to not only the strain, but then also conducive to a negative or non normative um, act as a reaction to that strain or stress. So things like group homes are very good examples. Programs ultimately that are designed to or have include in some way, shape, or form temporary housing. All of these things are very, very beneficial with regard to being able to uh, reduce strain or to isolate an individual for a temporary amount of time and then be able to equip them with the tools to be able to deal with the strain or stress when it occurs again. So again, strain theory is probably one of the most user-friendly schools of thought when it comes to the work of criminologists and, of course, the reforms that are ongoing within the criminal justice system. It is something that is unique because it deals with not only the structures of a society, but how social institutions, which are examples of structures, how those actively function. And again, kind of looking at how those particular kinds of social structures function is another one of its more important points. And then the kind of the last piece of strain theory that makes it very, very unique is that it is very much applied to solutions, right? Looking at how individuals and groups within a society can be given more opportunities to be able to choose a path that is, according to the larger society, a path that is correct or one that is not going to necessarily interfere with the rights and the experiences of others. And so, strain theory, in some way, shape, or form, is something that we see constantly at work in social and criminal justice reform. It's also something that very much incorporates a lot of the other theoretical schools that we've been taking a look at as part of this course and the topic of crime and deviant behavior.